The dust settled like a shroud over the parched earth, coating everything in a uniform, gray misery. Eleanor pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, but it offered little protection against the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, sharper than the chill wind whipping across the plains. 3 days without so much as a crust. Her hands trembled not just from the cold, but from a deep, bone-weary fear that had become her constant companion since he left. The small, desolate town ahead offered little comfort. Mostly grim faces and closed doors to a woman alone, with nothing. She clutched the bundle wrapped in faded calico. It was all she had left of a life that was supposed to be. A life promised. A life that had dissolved into dust and silence, leaving her adrift. Inside the calico lay her wedding dress. Cream-colored silk, simple but carefully made, bought with saved pennies and stitched with hopeful dreams. Now it felt like a mockery, a heavy, useless weight against her arm. Hope wouldn't feed her. Silk wouldn't quench her thirst. Desperation, cold and absolute, propelled her towards the mercantile. The air inside the shop was thick with the scent of dry goods, kerosene, and the stale sweat of men who lingered by the pot-belly stove. The merchant, a man whose face was as sharp and unforgiving as a rock, peered at her from behind his counter, his eyes holding no kindness. "What do you want, woman? Got nothing to give charity here." His gaze swept over her, lingering on the poorly concealed bundle, assessing, dismissing. Humiliation burned Eleanor's cheeks, hotter than the phantom warmth of the stove. She unwrapped the bundle, revealing the dress. The cream silk seemed unnaturally bright in the dim, dusty interior, a stark contrast to the grim reality of her situation. I need bread," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I have this, for bread." "Please," the merchant snorted, a harsh, ugly sound. He picked up a fold of the silk between thumb and forefinger, his expression one of utter contempt. "A dress? What good is this to me? Nobody's getting married here, not proper folk anyway. Maybe a few scraps for kindling." He dropped the fabric as if it were soiled rags. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Eleanor, threatening to drown her. She felt exposed, raw, her last shred of dignity stripped away with his cruel dismissal. Then, a shadow fell over the counter. A man stood there, silent, imposing. He hadn't been by the stove. He seemed to have materialized from the deeper shadows of the shop. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered and unreadable beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. Caleb, the rancher from the edge of the territory, rarely seen in town, rumored to be a man of few words and fewer friends, living a solitary existence on his remote spread. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, fixed on the dress, then on Eleanor's face. There was no pity there, but something else she couldn't decipher. A quiet assessment, perhaps, or simply a profound, shared understanding of loneliness. He didn't speak to her. He spoke to the merchant, his voice low, gravelly, cutting through the silence. "How much for the dress?" The merchant, clearly surprised by the intervention, sputtered. "It's worthless. Name a price," Caleb said, his tone flat, final. The merchant, sensing an unexpected profit, named a sum far too high for kindling, yet meager for silk. Caleb didn't haggle. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small pouch, and counted out the coins onto the counter. Then, without a word or a glance at Eleanor, he picked up the dress, careful not to crease the silk, wrapped it back in the calico, and turned to leave. Eleanor stared, stunned. He had bought it. Her dress. For her? No, for himself. He didn't look back. The merchant, grinning now, shoved a loaf of bread towards her. "Here. Your payment." Eleanor took the bread, the weight of it both a relief and a fresh burden. She had her food, bought with the last symbol of a broken past, purchased by a stranger who now held that symbol, and whose motives were a complete mystery. The taste of the bread was like ash in her mouth. Caleb found her sitting outside the mercantile, tearing off pieces of the bread with numb fingers, watching the dust devils dance in the street. He stopped a few feet away, his presence a quiet force. He didn't offer comfort, didn't ask questions. He simply stood there until she looked up. His eyes held that same unreadable depth. He still held the wrapped dress. "You need a place," he said, his voice the same low rumble. It wasn't a question. Eleanor merely nodded, unable to form words. Where else was there to go? "My place," he stated. Silence stretched between them, taut and heavy. Then he added, "I need a wife." The bluntness of it stole her breath. Not a partner, not a companion, but a wife. A transaction. The dress for bread, and now her life for shelter and security. The sheer audacity, the lack of preamble or sentiment, was staggering. Yet, in her utter destitution, it was also an offer, a way to survive. The alternative was the dust, the cold, the gnawing hunger that had nearly consumed her. He wasn't offering softness or love. He was offering structure, a roof, food, a chance to simply be. Her acceptance was a quiet surrender, not of spirit, but of circumstance. "Yes," she managed to say, the single word heavier than any vow. He didn't smile, didn't offer a hand. He simply turned and walked towards the edge of town where a wagon and 2 sturdy horses waited. She followed, the bread clutched tight, the knowledge of her traded future a cold knot in her stomach. The journey to his ranch was long, silent, and bone-jarring. The land grew emptier, harsher, mirroring the vast distance between them. The ranch itself was a collection of functional, unadorned buildings huddled against the wind. A small, sturdy house, a barn, corrals. It was clean, orderly, devoid of anything personal, reflecting the man who lived there alone. Inside the house, it was sparsely furnished, practical. A sturdy table, chairs, a basic stove, a clean cot in a small room off the main living area. He showed her where things were, indicated her room, offered her water. All with that same economy of movement and word. He placed the wrapped wedding dress on a high shelf in the main room, almost out of sight, a silent enigma. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the livestock. Dawn to dusk, work filled the hours. Eleanor, initially lost and uncertain, began to find a footing. She learned to keep the house clean, to cook the simple, hearty meals, to tend the small garden patch. Caleb worked the land, his movements efficient, tireless. They shared meals in near silence, the only sounds the scraping of forks, the wind outside. Conversation was limited to necessity, the weather, tasks for the day. He never asked about her past, never explained why he bought the dress, why he needed a wife. And she, bound by circumstance and her own reticence, never offered. Her internal world remained hers alone, a refuge from the stark reality of her marriage of convenience. Loneliness was still a presence, but it was a different kind now. Not the terror of being utterly alone in the world, but the quiet ache of being alone with someone. She watched Caleb, saw his quiet competence, his solitary strength against the unforgiving landscape, saw the lines etched deep into his face by sun and solitude, saw that he, too, was a man defined by the harshness of his environment and the solitude he had carved out for himself. He was not unkind. He was simply there, a silent, steady presence who provided the security she desperately needed, asking nothing in return but her silent presence and the performance of wifely duties that were more about running a household than sharing a life. Months bled into seasons. The harsh prairie summer gave way to the biting winds of autumn. Eleanor's hands, once soft, grew calloused. Her body, once weakened by hunger, gained a quiet strength from the physical work and steady meals. The initial fear of Caleb had softened into a wary respect, then a tentative comfort born of familiarity. She learned his habits, the subtle shifts in his mood she could read in the tension of his shoulders or the set of his jaw. She started calling the ranch their ranch, a small, internal claim on the place that had saved her. The silence between them wasn't as heavy now. Sometimes, it felt companionable. Little by little, unspoken understandings formed. He would leave firewood stacked neatly by the door when a storm threatened. She would have hot coffee ready when he came in from the cold. Small acts, devoid of fanfare, but significant in their quiet acknowledgement of the other's existence and needs. They worked side by side sometimes, mending fences, hauling water. Their movements were coordinated, efficient, a silent partnership in the demanding task of survival. One afternoon, mending a section of fence on the far side of the property, the quiet was broken by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders. Not neighbors, they were from town. Men Eleanor vaguely recognized from the mercantile, loud and rough. They reined in, regarding Caleb and Eleanor with smirks. The merchant was among them, his gaze flicking over Eleanor with an unpleasant knowingness. Well, well, look what the lonely rancher dragged home. One of them sneered. Heard you paid a good price for this one, Caleb. Did she come with the fancy dress? Caleb straightened, his face hardening into an expression Eleanor had never seen, cold, dangerous stillness. He didn't speak, just held their gaze, his hand resting casually near the axe handle he'd been using. The air crackled with tension. This was not a problem between them, but a problem for them. The outside world, with its cruelty and judgment, intruding on their fragile, unconventional peace. Just wondering how a man like you affords acquisitions, the merchant said, his eyes narrowed, full of malice. Especially after that business with the herd last spring. Losing cattle like that makes a man desperate. Desperate men do desperate things. By things they maybe can't rightly afford. He was clearly hinting at something, trying to bait Caleb, perhaps suggesting their marriage was somehow illicit or a sign of weakness. Eleanor felt a surge of fear, but also something new, anger. Anger at their intrusion, their assumptions, their cruelty. They saw her not as a person, but a possession. They saw Caleb as weak, a target. She stepped closer to Caleb, standing not behind him, but beside him, her posture small but resolute. It was a simple act, wordless, but it drew their attention. He afforded it, Eleanor said, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected, surprising even herself. He affords what he needs, and he needed help. She met the merchant's eyes, refusing to look away. The men exchanged glances, perhaps surprised by her quiet defiance. Caleb remained silent, but Eleanor felt his presence beside her, solid and steady. The tension held, thick and suffocating. The merchant spat on the ground. Think you're safe out here, Caleb? Think you've bought yourself protection? He laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. Things change. People get desperate. What's yours today? His gaze swept over Eleanor. Might not be tomorrow. The implicit threat hung heavy in the air. They didn't press further, not today. With a final, menacing look, they turned their horses and rode off, leaving the quiet of the ranch shattered. The butt had arrived, and Eleanor knew, with chilling certainty, that their unconventional life, her fragile safety, was now under threat. The dust settled again after the riders left, but the stillness they left behind was different, charged, watchful. Eleanor looked at Caleb. He was still standing rigid, watching the figures disappear on the horizon. The dangerous stillness remained. They meant trouble, she said, stating the obvious. He finally turned, his gaze meeting hers. There was no fear in his eyes, only a grim determination. "I," was all he said. He didn't elaborate on the merchant's veiled threats, or the mentioned cattle loss. He rarely spoke of himself or his troubles. But Eleanor understood. His isolation wasn't just preference, it was perhaps also a shield. And by marrying her, by bringing someone onto his solitary stage, he had inadvertently created a new vulnerability. Her. And they, the vultures from town, had spotted it. That night, the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't the comfortable silence of routine, but the charged silence of anticipation. Eleanor didn't sleep well. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the walls, sounded like an intrusion. She found herself thinking of the wedding dress on the shelf, the silk she had traded for survival. It had felt like giving up, like shedding the last skin of a failed life. But now, looking at Caleb, seeing the quiet strength in his profile by the lamplight as he sat watching the darkness outside, she wondered if it wasn't giving up at all. Perhaps it was a different kind of beginning, an exchange not just for bread, but for a chance at something real, something forged in necessity and shared hardship, rather than flimsy hope and empty promises. The but came again a few days later, not with a visit, but under the cover of darkness. They were woken by the sound of commotion from the corrals, shouting, the panicked bleating of sheep, the snorting of horses. Caleb was out of bed instantly, grabbing his rifle. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but the fear was different now. It wasn't paralyzing terror. It was sharp, adrenaline-fueled readiness. She didn't cower. She pulled on her boots and followed him to the door. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. For a second, she considered it. But then she remembered the merchant's smirk, the threat in his eyes. This wasn't just Caleb's fight. It was theirs. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. "I can help," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. Caleb paused, looked at her at the skillet. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and went out into the chaos of the night. Two figures were trying to cut the fence, spooking the livestock. One turned towards Caleb, a glint of metal in his hand. A shot rang out, but it was Caleb's warning shot into the air. He didn't want blood, just to scare them off. The other figure, closer to the house, saw Eleanor in the doorway holding the skillet. He started towards her, thinking her an easy target. But he was wrong. Eleanor didn't scream or run. She met his advance, swinging the heavy skillet with surprising force. It connected with a sickening thud, sending the man staggering back with a cry. The other figure, startled by the unexpected resistance from the woman, and hearing Caleb's purposeful steps approaching, turned and fled. The disoriented one, groaning on the ground, scrambled to his feet and stumbled after his accomplice, disappearing into the night. Silence returned, broken only by the settling livestock and their own ragged breaths. Caleb came back to the house. He looked at Eleanor, standing there with the skillet, her face pale but resolute. He looked at where the man had fallen. He didn't say anything about her action. He didn't need to. The shared moment, the unexpected partnership in the face of danger, spoke volumes. He took the skillet gently from her hand and set it down. Then he did something he had never done before. He reached out and lightly touched her shoulder. It was a brief, almost hesitant touch, but it conveyed more than any words could. Safety, acknowledgement, a quiet, unspoken bond forged in the crucible of shared threat. Later, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, the house was truly quiet. Eleanor looked up at the shelf where the wedding dress lay, still wrapped. It no longer felt like a symbol of a past failure or a transaction of desperation. It felt like the unlikely beginning of this of them. A woman who had sold her last hope for bread, and a man who had bought that hope and offered a different kind of future. Their life was hard, stark, etched against a brutal landscape. There was no grand romance, no flowery declarations. But there was something else. A quiet respect, a shared resilience, a partnership built on necessity and tempered by facing the darkness together. The world outside was still harsh, full of people like the merchant and his companions, ready to prey on the vulnerable. But Eleanor was no longer the woman who had stood in the mercantile, trembling and alone. She had found strength she didn't know she possessed, a voice she hadn't dared to use. And she was no longer alone. She was here on this desolate ranch, with this silent man who had bought her dress and given her a home. Their marriage wasn't born of love, but perhaps, in its own quiet, resilient way, it was building towards something just as strong, perhaps even stronger. A bond forged not in gentle sunshine and soft words, but in the dust, the silence, and the shared defiance of the storm. It was a partnership of survival, yes, but also a testament to the unexpected places where connection, safety, and a different kind of hope could take root. The future remained uncertain, like the vast, star-filled sky above the ranch. But for the first time in a long time, Eleanor faced it not with despair, but with a quiet, determined strength, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who had bought her dress.